So what happens when a government goes all in on social spending, but at the same time tries to keep its finances from spiraling out of control? Well, for the past 3 years, Brazil has basically been a massive, real-world experiment on that very question. We're going to break down that whole story, the ambitious policies, the surprising numbers, and the constant economic tightrope walk that has defined Lula's presidency.
To really get the stakes here, you have to rewind to the 2022 election. It was the tightest in Brazil's history. Lula won with just 50.90% of the vote. The country was split, right down the middle. And the question on everyone's mind was huge. Was this going to be a repeat of his past success, or was this the start of something much, much worse?
So, the new government's first move was a big one. It was a massive bet on social spending. The strategy was clear. People first, figure out how to pay for it later. The goal was to tackle poverty head-on, right away. But, as we're about to see, that whole paying the bill part, that quickly became the central challenge.
And we are not talking about small tweaks here. The scale of these changes was just enormous. The Bolsa Familia program, their flagship welfare plan, was expanded to cover over 20 million families. That cost an extra 14 billion reais a month. Get this, an 80% jump from the old program. On top of that, the minimum wage got its first real increase in 4 years. These were immediate, tangible benefits for millions of people.
Which, of course, leads to the multi-billion-dollar question, where on earth did the money for all this come from? The country's existing budget rules, this thing called the spending cap, just couldn't handle this kind of spending explosion. Something had to give. And the answer came in the form of a pretty clever workaround, the PEC da Transição. Basically, it was a constitutional amendment that Congress approved, and what it did was hit the pause button on the old spending rules. This gave the government a green light to spend an extra 145 billion reais in 2023, funding its entire social agenda right from the get-go.
Okay, so with those immediate social goals funded, the administration then turned its attention to a much bigger, much more complicated task, completely overhauling the country's long-term financial architecture. First thing on the list, getting rid of that old spending cap. The techo de gastos was like a financial straitjacket, tying any new spending strictly to last year's inflation. The new rule, the arcabouço fiscal, is way more flexible. It allows spending to grow up to 2.5% above inflation every year. This was a fundamental shift. It totally changed the game and gave the government a lot more breathing room.
And then came something that was, well, truly historic. After 3 decades, 30 years of debate, of failed attempts, and political gridlock, Congress finally approved a massive tax reform.
This was a huge deal.
So what problem were they trying to solve? Well, to put it mildly, Brazil's old tax system was a nightmare. Just imagine trying to run a business where you had to navigate these 5 different overlapping and incredibly complicated consumption taxes. It was a chaotic system that cost companies a fortune just to comply with. The solution was pretty radical in its simplicity. The reform just scraps all 5 of those confusing taxes and replaces them with just 2. It's based on the value-added tax system you see in a lot of other countries. One federal tax, the CBS, and one for states and cities, the IBS. A massive, long-overdue simplification. But, and there's always a but, right? That simplification comes with a pretty big number attached. 28%. That's the projected combined rate for these new taxes. So while the system is getting a whole lot simpler, Brazil could end up having one of the highest consumption tax rates in the entire world. Alongside these huge reforms, the hunt for revenue was just relentless. The government went after exclusive and offshore funds, targeting the super-rich, it reversed some old fuel tax cuts, and it closed a bunch of corporate tax loopholes. It was a constant effort to try and balance the books. All right, so after all these new rules, new taxes, and new spending, how did the economy actually do? Let's check out the scorecard, starting with that first year, 2023. Well, the economy showed some surprising muscle. The GDP, that's the gross domestic product, grew by a really solid 3.2%, which was better than a lot of people were forecasting. And the good news kept coming on the jobs front. The unemployment rate dropped down to 7.8%, a really significant improvement for the job market. And on the social side of things, the impact was clear and it was big. According to the National Statistics Institute, 8.7 million people were lifted out of poverty. But here's the other side of the coin. To make all of that happen, the government spent 230 billion reais more than it collected in revenue. So despite all those new taxes that promised zero deficit target, it was missed by a mile. This really showed the immense financial pressure that was building up.
So if 2023 was the year of bold new initiatives, 2024 was, well, it was the year of turbulence. A really controversial new tax on cheap international imports came into effect. The dollar shot up to a record high, which forced the central bank to jack up the main interest rate, the SELIC, to a 20-year peak of 15%. And to top it all off, inflation ended the year above the official target.
When you put the 2 years side by side, you get this really complex picture. The good news on growth and jobs continued. Unemployment even hit a historic low. But the deficit, while it was smaller, was still pretty big, and that missed inflation target showed that financial volatility had become a major challenge. And that brings us to the third year, the final stretch, where that push and pull between raising money and spending it became more intense and a lot more public than ever before. The criticism really started to mount. An opposition manifesto went viral with this killer statistic, claiming the administration had created or raised a tax, on average, once every 34 days. That narrative really put the government on the defensive.
And you could see this public pressure having a real effect. A controversial plan to monitor digital payments was pulled back after a huge outcry. An attempt to tax some popular types of investments was shot down in Congress. It seemed like the search for new revenue was hitting a brick wall. And yet, even as new social programs were being launched, the financial markets kind of found their footing. The dollar started to fall, and the stock market actually soared to record highs.
So when you just step back and look at the whole picture over these 3 years, a really clear pattern emerges. What you see are these undeniable social gains and strong economic growth, but they were all financed by higher spending and this constant, controversial hunt for more tax money. And that created this persistent shadow of fiscal concern that never really went away.
And so we end right back where we started, with a balancing act. It's been a story of real social progress, but it was bought at a pretty significant fiscal cost. And that leaves us with the one crucial question for the years ahead. Which side of this scale is ultimately going to define Brazil's future?